lasers, molecular alignment metallic alloys, integrated circuits, and micro-miniaturization of logic boards. And when I read this one, I thought to myself, my gosh, I've visited SAC headquarters some years ago, and I was taken into the computer room, and the computer filled the whole room from end to end. And today, thanks to this new technology, grace of our visiting friends, you could put more than that capacity in a box the size of that would fit into a picnic basket, or maybe even smaller. Then there was the HARP, the High Altitude Research Project, Project Horizon, which was the moon base, portable atomic generators, ion propulsion drive, irradiated food, third brain guidance systems, that's the headbands that the EBs worn to give instructions to their ships because they didn't use the conventional controls. It was all done by mental telepathy. And then particle beams, Star Wars, and missile weapon systems, electromagnetic propulsion systems, and depleted uranium projectiles. Well, I hasten to point out that in some of these areas, research was already being done. But in many of the others, it was not, because the technology that the visitors left when their crash occurred was light years ahead of ours. It is also worth noting, as some of Corso's detractors point out, that he didn't know what the Navy and the Air Force were doing at the same time in the same areas. And as a former Minister of National Defense, I can attest that with separate services, often they don't tell the other services what's going on. They treat them more as an enemy than they do as a member of the team. I am, of course, fascinated by the technical advances that we have made. They are mind-boggling, almost beyond comprehension. But these developments alone would not have been enough to get me to speak out. I went public because I am even more fascinated, and may I say concerned, by the geopolitics and the exopolitics of the intervening decades. These are two profoundly important issues that are difficult to talk about and impossible to debate when the official position of the United States remains that UFOs do not exist. Just 2 weeks ago, I listened to a United States scientist on a radio in Toronto describing what sounded like a rather expensive project to try and locate planets elsewhere in the cosmos that would sustain life. And she gave the impression that they hadn't yet found any, but they were going to keep on looking. And I was tempted to phone the radio station and say, why doesn't she just go and ask some of the people that have talked to them and ask them where they came from? And this is the kind of waste that goes on when the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. But I digress. I can understand the near panic in the late 40s and early 50s when all of a sudden the U.S. Armed Forces found themselves in a most unusual position. They had just contributed magnificently to the winning of the war in Europe. They were top dogs. And all of a sudden, they were confronted with a technology that was greater than their own, and they didn't know how to cope. And near panic set in. They knew that it was not of this world. And they decided to keep it a closely guarded secret on the basis that if the public was aware that there might be another panic, not unlike the one that Orson Welles created when he at his War of the Worlds as a Halloween hoax. I'm sure that an equal concern was that another earthly power, and I suppose we might just as well be specific and say the Soviet Union, might have the same kind of opportunity to develop the technology and might get ahead of the United States, and this could lead to a position where the United States would cease to be the predominant military power in the world. And this fear could have been nurtured by hints from Dr. Werner von Braun that the Germans might have had access to some of this technology as early as the 1930s. Well, this led the United States to embark on a reverse R&D program unprecedented in earthly history. Well, the secrecy made sense, in my opinion, until the end of the Cold War. But there is no legitimate reason why these clandestine operations should not have been made public when the Soviet Union collapsed. The United States had no other enemies with any military capability to speak of. There were no real threats. A good and a fairly large peace dividend could have been declared. But someone in the intelligence community decided that one or more of the alien species had hostile designs on Earth, and that we had to use the technology that we gained from them to make Earth an unfriendly and unsafe place for visitors from other realms. And if you Google the United States Air Force Space Command, you will find out that we are rapidly achieving that goal. And with the extension of the anti-missile, the dual-purpose anti-missile missile system around the globe, Earth will become increasingly out of bounds to visitors. We have learned, however, that intelligence gathering is an imprecise science, and interpreting it depends to a large extent on the interpreter's worldview. Witness the rationale for the Iraq War. I recall, too, the wildly inaccurate estimates of the United States Air Force of the rate of Soviet ballistic missile production. And this misinformation led to some very dumb decisions in my country. So the reason I decided to go public was the very real fear that military intelligence inadvertently or deliberately misinterpreted the intention of the aliens. And I use the word deliberately in the sense of General Eisenhower's warning that the alien technology was falling into the wrong hands. A more likely scenario than wanting to attack us, which they could have done at any time in those early years. There was really nothing to stop them, with the possible exception of some high-powered radars. But otherwise, there was no means to destroy them, and they had, complete domination of our skies. But instead of trying to destroy us, they seemed genuinely concerned about our stewardship of our planet. Through deforestation, chemical contamination, overpopulation, global warming, and above all, increasing stockpiles of atomic weapons that in the hands of a madman, their use could result in making the planet uninhabitable for heaven only knows how long. Well, it's interesting that Corso subscribed to this enemy alien concept at the time he wrote The Day After Roswell, but later changed his mind. And he might have been influenced in part by speaking to one of the visitors face to face. He was aware of a A landing